Hey, welcome back, AP Government. Hopefully you're doing well. You can see I'm sitting here getting warmed by the fire. Oh, there's the fire over there. Here at my own home. Looking forward to being back in EC Glass though, very, very soon, and talking to you guys as well. In this video, I want to talk to you guys quite a bit about civil liberties. So the last video I did was civil liberties and civil rights, kind of an overview of that one. So in this video, I want to kind of go deeper and really kind of talk about some major court cases involving civil liberties. So before we do that, let me give you a quick practice question, and let's see what you remember. Excuse me. Starting off, it says the 14th Amendment protects civil rights and civil liberties. You remember that? We said the 14th Amendment is key and that it has some of those provisions in there. So let's look at letter A. Describe the difference between civil rights and civil liberties. And that's a great question to kind of get you to think about. Obviously, one of them is basically trying to prevent the government from doing certain things. That would be more or less like civil liberties. These are protections, if you will, and civil rights are guarantees. They are actions the government must provide you, right? Look at letter B. Identify the primary clause of the 14th Amendment that's used to extend civil rights. If you remember that one is the Equal Protection Clause, right? That's the Equal Protection Clause extends civil rights to the states, and then that's the one that all civil rights are going to essentially be under. Describe a specific legislative action that extended civil rights to each of the following. So for women, we could put a couple things. We could put in here Title IX. We could put in here the 19th Amendment even, and allowing women the right to vote. For persons with disabilities, obviously the classical one is the ADA, right? That's the one we always look at, the unfunded mandate. Identify the primary clause of the 14th Amendment that's used to extend civil liberties. So this is not the Equal Protection Clause. This is going to be the Due Process Clause. That's right. And then you have to explain two of these cases, how the liberties were incorporated. If you remember, Gideon versus Wainwright, that's one of our key cases. That's going to say you have the right to an attorney. You have a right to have that Sixth Amendment protection at the state level, and that gets carried over to the state. Matt versus Ohio is all about unreasonable searches and basically having evidence that has to be dismissed if it's gained illegally. And then Miranda versus Arizona is the right to know your rights once you're accused of a crime, and basically kind of know your protections and what rights you have because of your due process. Okay, fun little review question there to kind of get the wheels turning, get you thinking about civil liberties, civil rights. In this video, I want to really sit on and talk about civil liberties and try to explore that a little bit more with you all. So just a quick review, there's a bunch of our court cases. Some of the cases we're going to use in civil liberties is definitely going to be Schenck versus U.S. If you remember that one, that was the whole clear and present danger one that says you can't yell fire in a crowded movie theater. One of the things you also can't yell shark at the beach. And maybe that's an easy way to remember Schenck because it kind of looks like the word shark. Right? You can't do that because it would create a panic, right? So you don't want to ever yell shark at the beach or fire and whatnot. So there can be some limits put on your freedom of speech. And so that's a big one there. Another freedom of speech one we could take a look at is Tinker versus Des Moines. That was the one with the black armbands and that you can't wear a black armband. Or was that what the school said? You couldn't wear a black armband to protest the Vietnam War. And Supreme Court says, actually, you can do that. Like, that's okay. We can't just impose an unlimited amount of restrictions on students' freedom of speech. So Tinker is going to allow people to have those kind of, as long as it's not like distraction kind of speech, that's okay. Of course, the school can determine that, and largely now the courts have reversed themselves on some of those things, and schools can limit pretty much whatever kind of shirt or speech they want to. The New York Times versus U.S., that's a freedom of the press one. So that's the one that deals with the Pentagon Papers and that we can't restrict what kind of messages the press is going to publish. And then jumping all the way down here, the very last one would be Citizens United versus FEC. That's also a freedom of speech one. It deals more with like money and speech and giving money into like kind of organizations, those independent expenditures, if you remember that, that support candidates as opposed to directly giving to candidates. But basically in Citizens United, they basically said all the restrictions that had been lifted or had been imposed because of the BCRA. We're now going to remove a lot of them, and corporations can now give money. Unions can now give money, and they can also endorse candidates if they want to in these advertisements. So a big deal there. Okay, let's talk about civil liberties some more. So the first key thing I want to talk about is freedom of religion. Now, freedom of religion, we can take a look at the free exercise clause. This is clearer of the two. Here's what the clause says. Congress shall make no law prohibiting the free exercise of religion, meaning Congress is not going to pass a law to stop your ability to practice your religion. Okay, there's a couple key court cases we can look at. Reynolds versus U.S. is a court case that's going to basically ban polygamy. It's going to say that you cannot have more than one spouse. So this is going to be somewhat of them saying, listen, even though we're not supposed to pass a law, we're going to say that you can only be married to one person. And those laws are still in the books. Maybe that'll change in the future. But Reynolds versus U.S. was the court case that happened back like in the 1890s, in which a family wanted to have more than one. I guess a husband wouldn't have more than one wife, and they eventually said, no, you can't do that. And even though that might be part of your religious practice, we're going to restrict that. Oregon versus Smith is another one dealing with your freedom of religion. This is the one involving some basically guys that went out and they smoked peyote, but they claimed it was part of their religious practice. Right? So because it's part of your religion, if you're a Rastafarian, are you allowed to smoke marijuana? Well, the Supreme Court has largely said no to that. If something is already a crime, you can't then claim religious freedom to then say, I'm going to go do it. Right? You can't do drugs and claim religious freedom. You couldn't go sacrifice an animal inhumanely, if you will, and then say it's part of my religion. Right? There's limitations on what you can do with your religion. And so again, it's kind of a tough one, but your rights ends where others begins. There's two more cases we could talk about. Wisconsin versus Yoder is the big one. That's the one that's your big one. You got to know for your course. And that one says you cannot force the Amish community to go to school beyond the 8th grade. Even though other kids have to go to school beyond the 8th grade, the Amish kind of have their own religious community standards and their own practices, and you cannot force them to go to school beyond the 8th grade as part of abiding by those religious kind of freedoms, and you have your own rules, so we're not going to impose upon that. Masterpiece Cake Shop versus Colorado. This is another really key court case that took place several years ago. It's going to, we could talk about this one some more, especially as we get into like LGBTQ rights. This is the one in which the guy is going to say, I'm not going to make the wedding cake for the gay couple because that would require me to make something and it would require me to be part of a ceremony that I disagree with. And the Supreme Court agreed with him, saying you do not have to do that. Now, saying that obviously it's not like saying you can't sell to people based on their sexual orientation, but they agreed with him that it was like forced speech in a way, and he's like, it's against my religious freedom to say I'm going to now take part in this ceremony when I kind of disagree with this, right? So this court case has come up and has been adjudicated a couple times. This is the first go at it in which the Masterpiece Cake Shop owner actually won the lawsuit and actually won the case where he said, I shouldn't be forced to do something that disagrees with my religious views, religious beliefs, and I shouldn't be forced to do that, if you will. Okay. And again, Supreme Court upheld that one. We'll talk about that one some more, though, because this is a key court case that's got some other details to it that are really fascinating. Okay. You also have the Establishment Clause. The Establishment Clause says that Congress cannot really pass any law that respects an establishment of religion. Congress is not allowed to basically endorse religion. Congress is not allowed to come out and say, you must go to church kind of thing, right? Obviously, we can't do that. So it's a general rule. There's a wall of separation, but there's holes that exist, right? Because there's certain things that, you have like the 10 Commandments on the edifice of the Supreme Court building, right? So there's certain things that kind of cross over where like, are you allowed to have that? Are you not? And this is where obviously we have a lot more cases on the Establishment Clause because it's murkier is what we say. right? There's a bunch of court cases here involving schools. The big one that you need to know is Engel versus Vital, right? Engel's going to be the one that says you cannot have school-led prayer anymore, right? And that was like a long time ago, at least back in the 60s. The teacher would stand up and say, okay, let's all pledge of allegiance, and then let's all say our prayer. And they would all lead them into this kind of school-led prayer. And obviously that was struck down because you're not supposed to have school-led prayer in public school. And again, you could pray all day long if you want to as a student. You just can't have teacher-led prayer or like school-led prayer. School and religion is not supposed to be, obviously tied together. Not in a public school, at least. And then you can look at a couple other cases here. The Lemon versus Kurtzman. This one's going to establish what's called the Lemon test. And we use the Lemon test to determine if something violates the Establishment Clause. Okay. So a lot of times we use cases called that become test to kind of use as like this precedent, right? So we're going to now use this court case to determine if something, does it have like an overt religious nature? Is it able to be used in another context, like historical context? Or, there's another court case here, Stone versus Graham. And this is an easy one to remember. Stone versus Graham was a court case that says you can't have the Ten Commandments posted in your school unless it's part of like a historical display of laws or something. Like if I'm a history teacher and I want to talk about, I don't know, the early times with like the Israelites or whatever, and if I want to have different religious symbols and whatnot to talk about the world religions, certainly you could talk about the religions in that context, right? You just can't have it as a standalone kind of example of in your face to try to almost like endorse this religion. And of course this goes beyond, like so many court cases then come up. What about are you allowed to have a minute of silence? Supreme Court's agreed that a minute of silence is fine because it's not like endorsing of religion. What about, are you allowed to pray before a football game? And the Supreme Court says, no, definitely you cannot do that. That's not supposed to happen. Even though, some coaches have gotten fired from this, you're not supposed to have any kind of endorsed school-led prayer and any kind of school function because it violates the Establishment Clause. Okay. And there's just a couple more. Another one, Lynch versus Donnelly. Lynch versus Donnelly is kind of a fun one in the sense of public religious displays. It basically says you're allowed to have the manger scene on like city property if it's got Santa Claus, because Santa Claus makes it commercial. And as long as Santa Claus is present, you can have the manger scene, with the little baby Jesus and, the wise men and whatnot. Because Santa Claus is there, it's commercial, which is kind of interesting. So Lynch versus Donnelly is going to be the one that kind of says, well, as long as you got the non-religious person, then we'll allow that. Here's some other kind of religious displays. What they did in Florida was they said, if we're going to allow for any religious group to have a display, we will allow for any group then. So you have, the Happy Holidays from the Satanic Temple there. And this is going to be with the Capitol Review Board. Another court case here saying, listen, if we're going to now for any group, the KKK gets to have a display as well. This is also the Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster, the Pastafarians, as they're called. And this is, again, somewhat of a spoof on religion, if you will, more of like an atheistic, kind of agnostic religion in which they kind of make fun of religion in many ways. But they got to have their display in Florida as well. You can see there, it's just basically it looks like hay, but I'm not sure what that is, with some eyeballs there, and there's their display. So anyway, basically cities have to kind of deal with this issue of freedom of speech quite a bit. Okay, I talked about Schenck versus U.S. Schenck versus U.S. is going to set up the clear and present danger test. Originally, there was the bad tendency test, right? The bad tendency test was basically anything used to promote illegal behavior was not allowed. So you think about music back in like the 1940s, 1930s. You couldn't talk about doing drugs, about going and committing crimes, that was not allowed. That was the bad tendency test time when the Supreme Court is going to be much more willing to strike down speech. Obviously, the clear and present danger time, this is going to be okay, we're going to really make sure that you can't have any kind of public safety threats. Now we have the preferred position doctrine. And what that basically means is, and this is trying to show you the growth of freedom of speech, is that the Supreme Court's not going to say you can't say something. There's a few areas that are not protected. Everything else is largely protected. Now, it doesn't mean you can't get fired. It doesn't mean that, you can't lose your job. It just means you can't go to jail. You can't get in like legal trouble for this speech. Okay. Here's some limitations on speech. You're not supposed to have any kind of slander or libel. Now, slander and libel is going to basically be words that are false and that have defamation. If you can actually say that what you said is not only untrue, but I lost money as a result, that's a lawsuit, and that would be something you can make a lot of money on because you're saying you hurt my character, you're defaming, my business, or you're defaming my own professional, career, and therefore I lost money, and that's a lawsuit. Okay. Fighting words are definitely not protected. This is things including hate speech. You're not allowed to say things like, "Hey, I'm gonna go burn your house down." Just kidding, right? Like there's things you can't do. Even on social media, you're not supposed to text certain things or say certain things. Or then, I mean, they could get you in trouble because they're fighting words because it's kind of that public harm. Obscenity, yes, obscene things are definitely not protected. Whether this is curse words, whether this is like pornography, whether this is just things you're not supposed to see on television because we have the FCC, excuse me. So this is where obscenity is definitely not covered, and so there's a lot of limits on what we can view, what we can't view, and all that. Reno versus the ACLU was the court case that basically said regarding the internet, it's extremely difficult to monitor the internet. But basically, this is the court case that says if you are about to view something explicit, they'll say you have to agree that you're over the age of 18. Right, and that's where you check the box, which is, of course, a fail-safe way to keep kids from ever accessing things they're not supposed to see. But that's basically what they have in there, is that somewhat of a check to say, listen, if you are about to, to let you know you're about to view something that you need to be 18 years or older to view, so you have to agree that you're over that age. Okay. And then the last kind of speech is commercial speech. Commercial speech is definitely not protected either. You can't be like, wow, look at the sham wow. It just removed the fat right off my arm, right? I mean, it just erases obesity. It's gone, right? Cancer, it's gone, right? Just it wipes it away. You can't claim freedom of speech for that either, because obviously that's a false accusation or that's a false advertisement, and you can't have misleading ads and that kind of stuff. So you can't say freedom of speech, unprotected in that. Okay, so there's some unprotected speech there on that. I'm going to end off this video on this one, guys. I can take a look at a few more examples showing you freedom of speech, and we'll get into that in the next video. Thanks for watching, and we'll talk to you guys soon.